It's been known for some time that the town of Libby, Montana suffered an environmental disaster at the hands of a company called W.R. Grace, which is now bankrupt. W.R. Grace was there running a mine, digging up a mineral called vermiculite. It was widely used to insulate homes across the nation. 5 years ago, ABC's 2020 reported that it turned out that vermiculite mine was spewing asbestos into the air all over town. Lung cancer rates were going off the charts in that tiny community. The team that worked on that 2020 broadcast tipped us off here at Nightline that the U.S. attorney in Montana has now won indictments against several of that bankrupt company's senior management, who could face years in prison. And this isn't just about Montana. That stuff they mined traveled by rail and truck to more than 42 states for processing and ended up lining the walls and attics of more than 30 million homes where it remains today. The question Dave Marish looks at tonight: where else are people getting sick? Here's his report.
Vermiculite, the ore that made Libby, Montana, toxic. First, the lethal tremolite asbestos in the ore killed miners.
When I started there was 135 guys. And right now, I think there's 5 of us out of those 135 that's still alive today.
Then the fibers brought home on miners' clothes.
When you'd wash his clothes, it would stay in the wash machine.
Spread asbestos to wives and children as well.
So you have also been diagnosed
and our 2 older children.
And your 2 older children.
Okay, again.
Most recently, new cases of asbestos-related disease are being found in the lungs of young people with no connections to the mine. They just grew up downtown near the old processing plant. Or they played ball on an asbestos-contaminated field.
Who would ever imagine as a little boy playing Little League Baseball in Libby, Montana, to be diagnosed with something so terrible?
What these cases confirm is what medical studies done in 1969 by the mine's owner, W.R. Grace, and unearthed through litigation 30 years later by local advocate Gayla Benefield suggested that even short-term or low or incidental exposures to tremolite asbestos can do serious damage to your health. What this has meant to Libby is, by Gayla's count, 258 deaths and 1,100 people, that's more than 1 out of every 6 people in the town, currently under treatment for asbestos-related lung disease.
All this is vermiculite, and this is the color of the dust.
When W.R. Grace shipped its vermiculite out of Libby, medical experts say they exported the toxic asbestos threat with it to processing plants in 236 other cities and towns in 42 states, like Dearborn, Michigan, where a young Richard Uranus worked 30 years ago.
That's the plant. That was the area that had the furnace where the ore was exfoliated, heated to 1,200 degrees.
Today, Richard Uranus has asbestosis, and his doctor says he got it on the job at W.R. Grace.
It's kind of hard to look at that building, because, it took my life in 5 years.
Okay, I'll listen to your back.
Richard's doctor is the nationally known expert on asbestosis, Michael Harbert.
I have patients who have worked at the facility, patients who poured the vermiculite, people who worked in the steel mills, who tell me they would take trucks and go to this plant and load in the vermiculite-based product called monocoat, which contains asbestos fibers, who have asbestosis.
As in Libby, the vermiculite plant generated a lot of unease in surrounding neighborhoods.
There was an attempt to clean up a number of years ago, and there was vermiculite and asbestos fiber found beyond the borders of the factory. And if there are asbestos fibers in an environment, then there is an increased risk of developing asbestosis. There's an increased risk of developing mesothelioma, a particularly horrible form of cancer of the lining of the lung.
Across the country, from Dearborn, Michigan to Denver, Colorado to Hamilton Township, New Jersey, investigators are scouring old vermiculite processing sites for signs of asbestos fibers, and they're finding them. And in New Jersey, at least, says the state's attorney general, they're finding evidence that W.R. Grace lied about what was there.
They represented that there were only trace amounts of asbestos in vermiculite materials and the soil that surrounded the plant. We have had studies done, and it shows that as much as 40% of the soil was contaminated with asbestos.
New Jersey is suing Grace and two of its executives for their alleged misrepresentations. And Attorney General Harvey says the fines could run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. And a Trenton newspaper reports that a grand jury is also exploring possible criminal charges against Grace and its officers. So far, Grace has not answered the Attorney General's charges.
I've not seen one penny from W.R. Grace.
States can sue, but can they collect? Grace went bankrupt years ago, and its successor company, while very profitable, accepts only limited liability for what its predecessor did, even though the then CEO of Grace, Peter Grace, had been on notice for years about the dangers of vermiculite ore. In 1969, a special in-house report forwarded directly to him concluded with this chilling and specific warning, quote, vermiculite ore from Libby contains tremolite asbestos, which is usually part of the rock remaining in the concentrate when shipped. Tremolite asbestos is a definite health hazard at both the Libby operation and at the expanding plants using the ore. Rich Urena says nobody warned him. Instead,
they passed out those the ubiquitous little white masks. Yeah, with the yellow elastic band that everybody uses for painting, which are completely absurd. They do nothing to stop asbestos fibers. Nothing stops asbestos fibers quite like your lungs.
Who's warning the workers of today of their potential risk from exposure to asbestos? The mayor of Libby worries.
It really, affects the tradespeople that are out doing rewiring, the plumbers, things like that, and they're the ones that really need to know.
What millions of homeowners also need to know. Between 15 and 30 million American homes have zonalite insulation in their attics, and zonalite contains tremolite asbestos, which can kill you.
That vermiculite they dug out of the ground in Libby, Montana, ended up in millions of homes across America, including in Denver, Colorado. Once again, here's Dave Marish.
I knew that I had vermiculite insulation in the house when I bought it in 1986, but I didn't know that it might be hazardous at all.
Denver, Colorado homeowner Glenn Wallace lives effectively downstream from Libby, which is where his vermiculite came from.
There was a bag left up there. It was zonalite from Libby, Montana.
Glenn has had his insulation tested, and the asbestos level was within the current legal standard.
It's still, I consider it still hazardous and dangerous to breathe.
It's generally agreed in medicine that there is no such thing as a safe exposure to asbestos.
When he's dealing with anything that might contain asbestos, industrial hygiene specialist Andre Gonzalez takes no chances and follows all the federal requirements.
We did wear a Tyvek suit with a hood, and we have a respirator on. And then we also usually wear some gloves. It's got some booties that go over your shoes, and then you have to decontaminate yourself properly to make sure you're not spreading the contamination anywhere else afterwards.
Gonzalez says checking out suspect asbestos in Denver area homes keeps him very busy.
If the home is built in the 50s, 60s, and the 70s, those are probably the homes that I would suspect might have the asbestos.
That's when America's home insulation of choice was W.R. Grace's zonalite, which contains that vermiculite mined in Libby, Montana. Grace contends its attic insulation poses, quote, no unreasonable risk to homeowners. The EPA has a different view.
Zonalite insulation contains asbestos. The EPA found that even with a minimal stirring up of the substance, asbestos fibers were suspended in the air at dangerous levels. We know when this asbestos is suspended in the atmosphere of an attic, it can downdraft through light soffits, through other imperfections in the seal between the attic and the rest of the home, allowing there to be asbestos throughout the home.
Zonalite can be rotted.
What can you do? Experts agree vermiculite sealed inside attics and walls poses little threat. But if you see insulation material lying around loose, especially if it has a kind of kitty litter-like look, or if you see a tear in a bag of insulation between the beams of your attic, do nothing. Back away and call for qualified help, because dangerous asbestos fibers can be hidden in a lot of household materials.
If you're going to disturb them, they are concerned when a person plans a renovation, or if they plan on peeling up their linoleum or their floor tile, or knocking down walls, taking ceiling tile out. That can be a problem at that time.
If you were unlucky and got a snootful of asbestos fibers, could that mean trouble for you? The answer seems to be yes.
We know that fairly low exposures can create fatal disease. We know that these low exposures are associated with a high incidence of mesothelioma, which is the pleural cancer that's essentially untreatable.
This next one, big, huge, deep breath in.
And under these dire circumstances, would you be eligible for federally subsidized health care? That answer is probably no, under the Fairness in Asbestos Injury Resolution Act, which is soon to be brought before Congress. This bill creates a $140 billion trust fund, paid for by the asbestos industry, for health care. But the fund is focused first and foremost on Libby, says the bill's chief sponsor.
Libby had a phenomenal exposure, and that's why they're covered. There are other areas which have had lesser exposure, and we're taking a look to see if it is equitable to cover them, and candidly, if the trust fund could afford it.
Which may mean that even Michigan processing plant worker and diagnosed asbestosis sufferer Rich Uranus may be left out in the cold, not to mention the people who live in his plant's downwind neighborhoods.
If there are some who are not covered, there is a special panel to grant compensation in special cases.
Could it operate like the special W.R. Grace medical panel in Libby, which just reduced coverage to 176 people diagnosed with asbestos-related disease? No one will really know until the last word is written into this bill. And some would say not until the last lobbying dollar is spent on what has already been an enormous industry effort.
There's a huge amount of money, $144 million in 2003, 2004 that we were able to document. It's almost as though the companies are looking at the Congress as a slot machine. They put in a certain amount of money, much less than what they're going to get paid back.
The bill does save the asbestos industry billions of dollars and caps victims' awards and denies them the right to sue. Co-sponsor Patrick Leahy, the ranking Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, says all of those sacrifices will produce a benefit.
I hope that what it does give a whole lot of people who are suffering from asbestos exposure some compensation for what they've suffered. Compensation that they're never going to get otherwise, because companies will either go bankrupt or they'll evade them.
Good breath, yeah.
Jeff Evgene, one of those very victims, offers this advice to the senator and his colleagues.
I want them to really think about what they're doing before they sign a bill that limits the liability of a company that knew full well the hazards they were dealing with. And yet they elected to take money over people's lives.
It's an awful story, the history of vermiculite from Zonalite Mountain. It remains to be seen if it's going to get better or worse. I'm Dave Marish for Nightline in Libby, Montana.
Joining me now, reporter Andrew Schneider of the Baltimore Sun. We like to say in the business that some people own a story, and he owns this one. Andrew Schneider first broke the story of trouble in Libby, Montana when he was at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer back in 1999. And Andrew, that's 6 years we're talking about. And the bill that Dave Marish referred to in his report, that some Libby residents and others downstream will hope will compensate them. That bill's been wandering through Congress for something like 2 or 3 years now. Is it designed and actually written for the Libby situation?
No, absolutely not. That was one of the biggest problems and one of the major concerns that the opponents had of it. It had nothing to do with Libby. Under the original language of the bill and under a very unusual medical criteria that the American Bar Association put together, people with the kind of disease that they have in Libby, from the type of fiber, the tremolite fiber that Dave talks about, didn't manifest itself in a way that it would be covered by that medical criteria. So people from Libby and all the plants around the country that Dave's talking about basically wouldn't be covered.
So they were left out.
they were left out.
And now I understand that amendments have been made that might include them?
Well, there have been several amendments over the last 3 years that theoretically would include them. The question is, will they?
So they're still possibly hanging out there with the illness and without compensation?
Yeah, lots of people believe that everyone in Libby is still hanging out there.
What became of the officers of W.R. Grace once it went bankrupt? What did they end up doing?
Well, the majority of the people that have been indicted are still employed by the company in other, in other companies that Grace owns. It's a very large worldwide conglomerate. Many of them have been moved to other sections. I believe out of the 7 indicted, only 2 of them are retired.
So they went up, they continued to go on with their jobs, essentially, with their careers.
That's true.
Did anyone ever apologize, ever admit any sort of at least moral liability? And I ask that knowing that doing that would put them in terrific legal danger, but did anybody ever say, I'm sorry?
To the best of my knowledge, no official ever did that.
Now we've got the situation that Dave Marish described where there's a fear that the poison, the toxin, has essentially moved downstream, and Senator Specter raises the question of whether you can actually make the case that the material from Libby is what's making people sick in 42 other states. What do the doctors say about that finally?
It depends on the doctors you talk to. I will tell you that the real concern among public health is what Marish talked about last night, and that's the 15 to 35 million homes that have the contaminated Grace insulation in their attics. You will probably see, it is believed, significant numbers of people coming down with asbestos disease for the next several decades.
Next several decades. So right. we're talking about potentially, if you're talking about 1 million homes, are you talking about millions of people?
Well, you're talking about, government estimates between 15 million and 35 million homes have it. 4 people in a home, it depends who gets up there.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious to know whether, given that this is the age of the internet and your article can more or less flash anywhere around the country quickly, are you getting a sense that people are beginning to read your reporting over the last 6 years and getting scared about this? Or is this still very much a stealth thing?
I think the issue of what exists around the country and what exists in the attics is clearly unknown by most. EPA promised passionately to let the public know of the dangers in their attics. They were going to put notices in all the major hardware chains. They were going to go on the major talk shows. That never happened.
Why not?
You'll have to ask them. It's a very sensitive issue. I'm sure your people have told you that the White House is extremely interested in having this legislation passed. EPA and the other agencies in the government that deal with asbestos have basically been told to keep it quiet. They don't want any opposition to this. Remember, President Bush, in his State of the Union address, one of the things he said he wanted was asbestos tort reform. The pressure from this comes from the highest levels. The White House clearly doesn't want any of the medical professionals in the government agencies to make noise about the potential danger to the public.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Andrew Schneider of the Baltimore Sun. Now, if you're concerned what you just heard in that conversation and in Dave Marish's report and want to determine whether your house is possibly contaminated with the toxic form of vermiculite, you can go to the Nightline page at abcnews.com.